But even if you have this panic mentality, I wanted to just cover a few solutions that regulators should be considering. We did this paper called Meeting New Demand Growth Without New Gas, where we covered kind of 6 key solutions. And if there's one takeaway I have for regulators, it's that they cannot forget about the demand side. And by this, I mean both efficiency, demand response, and behind-the-meter generation and storage. These things can come online quickly, and they are also part of the reason we stopped having to build new coal-fired power plants in the late 2000s.
This whole question of how to meet new demand deserves further explanation, and that paper that you and your colleagues have done, I think, is a really important contribution to this whole question. I mean, even if we thought that there might be some states where PUC might have sufficient justification to subvert the usual procurement process and fast-track new IOU spending to meet expected demand, there's this whole nother set of questions that we should be asking about the best way to meet it, because it looks like all the utilities that are issuing these calls for new capacity are only interested in meeting it with the most long-term expensive way, by building new gas plants or possibly new nuclear plants. Which certainly makes sense if their goal is to increase their returns on their capital spending, to increase their own revenue. But if our goal is to meet this alleged new demand at the lowest cost to ratepayers, then I think we'd be doing anything but that. We'd be looking instead at efficiency and demand response projects first, because those are definitely cheaper, then maybe some cheap wind and solar and batteries, and only really looking at gas as a last resort, and not looking at nukes at all because conventional plants are far too expensive and slow, and SMRs don't really exist commercially, as we've discussed recently in episodes 209 and 219. So, as you pointed out in a recent article, in addition to the Georgia Power IRP, Duke Energy recently requested an additional 2.7 gigawatts in the next decade in North Carolina as part of a total 9 gigawatt increase. PJM, the largest regional grid operator in the U.S., added another 10 gigawatts to its demand forecast for the upcoming decade, and so on. And they all claim that gas-fired power plants will be needed to meet that demand, in many cases using non-industry standard methodologies that by design exclude the potential for wind, solar, battery storage, demand response, and other elements of the energy transition portfolio. So I want to go back to this paper that you and your colleagues did. Maybe you could just sort of elaborate why you don't think gas plants are the right way to meet this alleged new demand.
Yeah, thanks. So what we did is we created a brief that's meant to give regulators inspiration to ask good questions and apply skepticism to these utility proposals and the panic tone around load growth and the need to invest immediately in large gas-fired power plants. And we really highlight 6 main solutions. The first one is energy efficiency. So the states you mentioned that keep popping up, the Carolinas, Georgia, Tennessee, they're vastly underinvesting in energy efficiency through utility programs. Tennessee is saving less than 0.1% annually, for example, via efficiency spending. And you can contrast this with California, Massachusetts, that are more near the 2% annually range. These programs work. They're responsible for about 1/3 of the demand increase that never happened between 2007 and 2020. And then there's federal appliance standards, which keep coming. DOE just proposed a standard on water heaters, essentially requiring all new electric water heaters to be heat pumps instead of resistance heat. That would really help the South, where resistance heat is the norm. And if we can do the same for electric resistance heating, both through incentives and standards, it's going to be a massive improvement for peak demand, especially during winter demand spikes that are driving this gas build. So looking to the demand side, on the efficiency side, the second one is building new renewables and storage where possible. So renewables and storage can reuse existing interconnection infrastructure to connect to the grid faster, starting with the sites of retiring coal plants. There's a great report from RMI about clean repowering that shows there's about 250 gigawatts of clean energy projects that could leverage existing or retiring fossil interconnection rights to connect to the grid, with the greatest opportunities, no surprise, in the Southeast region. And then projects under development can also add storage to those developments to bolster peak reliability value contributions, especially solar projects. So there was a recent contract for solar plus storage in Utah in which Rocky Mountain Power simply quadrupled the storage procurement in response to growing demand. So the third one is generating closer to demand. So distributed solar has reduced U.S. demand by about 1.5% between 2014 and 2022, according to EIA data. But that deployment is uneven across states and regions. Yeah, if you look at the EIA Data Explorer, it's about 62 terawatt hours per year that come from distributed solar. So that's roughly the same amount of new demand that IEA and others are projecting from data centers. So reducing obstacles and increasing support for these resources, especially in states that haven't really gone big on distributed solar and storage, could take a big bite out of demand growth and peak growth. And additionally, if possible, large customers with the kind of purchasing power that we've been talking about, they have opportunities to add resources on site and offer demand flexibility to offset the need for additional peak capacity. And again, like this is something that the Clean Energy Buyers Association was explicitly asking Georgia Power for the ability to do. But Georgia Power basically said, oh, sorry, we haven't developed a tariff for that. And that would be too complicated. That would take too long. But that panic mentality applies to gas, but apparently not to meeting what customers want to bring to the grid.
Yeah, it's amazing how quickly they can come up with a tariff that actually benefits them, too, historically speaking.
I think if we're talking about things outside of the normal process, Microsoft, bring your contract, bring your proposal, and let's just evaluate it on par with these new gas plants. But anyways, I digress. So number 4 is working with big customers to flex demand. So we've been talking about interruptible tariffs, but some large customers, including data centers, can lower power use when the grid is stressed if they're paid to do so. Now, I've heard that there's a difference between what AI training models are willing to do and what a traditional data center is willing to do. But I think what's true now may not be true later, especially if we set up incentives now for these data centers to become flexible. So Google recently announced it cracked the code to reducing data demand in hours when the grid is stressed. So it can defer processing or move it to a different part of the country. And it's demonstrated successful pilots in Oregon, Nebraska, the Southeast, where it's doing this. So like in South Carolina, for example, projections for short duration winter shortfalls in capacity are driving calls for new gas. It's not like we're going to be out of energy for days at a time. It's just these sort of peak periods. Why can't a data center or some other load shift that? I think we need to examine that. Number 5, making better use of existing power infrastructure. So this is things like grid enhancing technologies, reconductoring that can come online and increase transmission capacity much faster and at lower cost than a traditional transmission, greenfield transmission project. And you mentioned a blank check for transmission. Having Georgia Power or other utilities examine reconductoring as a low-cost alternative would be a wonderful addition to the policymakers' scrutiny of this proposal.